Sarah Bowe. Sarah is the associate professor in the practice of the history of Christianity, and she may have to tell us exactly what that means, and the senior director of digital learning. She is also an ordained Presbyterian minister. She has a PhD from Emory, her Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, a BA from Davidson, and a diploma from Lubbock.
Thank you. My 20-year reunion was this weekend. It's horrifying, so you can do the math about how old I am. Thank you for that really warm welcome, Jill and Belmont. Thanks for carrying the banner through the first couple of weeks. I appreciate it. Welcome to the stories we tell. I will open every class with a hilarious medieval meme. So if you can't read what it says, when you're a medieval artist and totally know what horses look like from the front. That blobby looking thing on the right hand side is also a horse, just from the front. But I thought it'd be great just to give you a little introduction to who I am. I am married to Adam Bowers, who is there. He is not here. Ordinarily he would come with me. He's a big fan of the medieval, but he is with his mother in Michigan, who is in hospice. So I would appreciate your prayers for her. Her name is Claudia. I also have a dog named Lucy. I am an early medievalist. I focus on 10th century nuns, one of whom you will meet 3 Sundays from now and learn how to say her name, Hrotsvit. It's like at the back of your throat, like a lot of phlegm. Hrotsvit of Gandasan. It's going to be really fun. The best part is learning how to say the fun names. But I mostly focused, my dissertation was on the series of saints' lives she wrote and the role that those saints' lives played in educating women in her monastic community. So I've always been interested in literacy and the role that stories play in pedagogy. How do we teach people best? We tell them a good story, right? We don't hit them with the facts immediately. We invite them in with a story. So I've always been excited about that. I've been a librarian at Pitt's Theology Library for many years before I transitioned to the Director of Digital Learning role, which I took in December of 2019. That was terrible timing. That was terrible. Yeah, three months into the job, the dean came to my office and he had never come to my office before and said, we have to close the school and we need to put it online. I said, great, we can do that. And it turned out just fine, and I really enjoyed helping Cameron launch a number of new programs, including a hybrid Master's of Divinity degree. So if anyone's interested in MDiv, we have a degree for you. I'm ordained in the PCUSA. I'm a big fan of young adult fiction, so if you have kids or young adults in your life, I have recommendations. Popcorn and naps. Those are the things you need to know about me. And yes, I am wearing the same dress in that photo that I'm wearing right now. It's my medieval tapestry dress. It has like foxes and things on it. I'm just like living into the medievalist right now. So, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is the name of the course. Why the stories we tell? Not just because, like I said, stories play a really crucial role in pedagogy, but because Clifford Geertz, who many of you may know is a famous anthropologist, used to say that culture is simply this. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I think that the saints' lives and the story of the medieval period are stories that Christians, sometimes white Christian nationalists, tell themselves about themselves. And as fellow Christians, it's our job to interrogate some of these stories and think critically about how we can re-image them and recontextualize them in the past where they actually were, instead of being flattened out to no nuance in the way they've been done now. I also start every class with a sort of check-in. How are we doing today? These are 7 images from medieval marginalia, and I'm asking you, which of these most exemplifies how you're feeling today? Number 1 is a monk stealing all the good craft beer. 2 is a demon with 1,000 eyes and anxiety. 3 is Virgin Mary regretting all her life choices. 4 is a skeleton thrilled by a recent impulse purchase. 4 is a bunny stabbing a guy and it says cute and ready to kill a man. Number 6 is, oh, I'm hanging in there, getting stabbed in the head. And the 7th is unidentifiable. Can you turn to the person next to you and tell them which of these medieval marginalia most exemplifies how you're feeling today? And if you're in the chat, you may put it in the chat.
I would like to pay you a compliment because it takes a lot of self-confidence to point out you've got the same dress.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll own it. I love this dress. It's Bowden. Feel free to ask me for future in a minute. So which of these are you guys? Right now, I am definitely a 6. Hanging in there. Yeah. Anybody want to tell us about a recent impulse purchase? No? I just bought a solo stove. That was very exciting. Whoa, stove. Instagram told me to buy it, so I bought it. I'm one of those. Awesome. Anybody demon with 1,000 eyes and anxiety? It's the end of the semester. I am also that. Awesome. Well, we'll start every class with one of these. So get prepared to tell your neighbors more things about yourself than perhaps you wish they knew.
Will it be the same or different?
Oh, no, it's always different. There's enough medieval marginalia to go many moves, I promise. Yes, don't you worry. All right. So just to sort of open the floor, and you don't need to come to the microphone, you can just kind of shout it out. When you hear the word medieval, what comes to your mind?
Old.
Old.
Castles and knights.
Castles, knights,
Dark ages.
dark ages. Yes, we're going to unpack that one.
Manuscripts.
Manuscripts,
A world,
beheadings.
a world lit only by fire.
A world lit only by fire. That's very poetic. Love it. On brand.
Cruel.
Yeah, I know.
Cruel.
Cruelty. Yeah. What else? Middle Ages. Turkey legs. Renaissance festivals. Jousting. Yes. A Knight's Tale. Yes. All these things. Would you say the term, as it's understood now, has a positive or negative connotation? Almost universally negative, right? And it's negative because it's what's it used to describe in contrast. If the bad is medieval, what's the positive? Enlightenment. Oh, absolutely. This is at the crux of what we're going to talk about today. The naming of time periods says a lot about the people who are doing the naming and not about the people being named. And I think that's a truism that will continue to be factual. And as you all read last week, David Carey, the introduction to Whose Middle Ages, talked about how there is no such thing as the Middle Ages, and there never was. This isn't unusual. All eras are fictions. And you're like, Sarah, medieval is like in your title. What are you talking about that it doesn't exist? What do I mean when I say it doesn't exist?
The victors write history.
The victors absolutely write history, absolutely. And the other sticky wicket is that the victors and their scholars write history, right? It's true, because it's not just, oh, these people were successful militarily. It means that culture then is in charge of the archives. They're in charge of the narration. Yes, John?
It's sort of like saying, we're not aware of the era we're in today.
Absolutely.
But at some point down the road, somebody will
Be like, this is
label it, and that becomes whatever.
the dopey digital age. That's what they're gonna call it, right? And nobody who's in it is like, man, I'm so glad I was born in late antiquity. It's a much better place than the early medieval period. No, the people living in it don't have any sense of that periodization, because the periodization is always superimposed, and it's always superimposed retroactively, right? It's exciting to sort of have that revelation, and then the next minute you're terrified, because then it means literally everything you've been taught about history might not be accurate.
Also, a lot of the population of the time, anytime, are not represented.
Absolutely.
They don't have a voice.
Nope.
They're
Absolutely.
particularly in some of the more
Yes.
places. There's more of that because
Yes.
they were not interesting to the people who were in charge.
Yes, absolutely. As is being said for the folks online, the average everyday person, Joe Medieval, if you will, who's running around is probably not going to be captured in some significant way for history, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second when we think about the concept of archives and who decides what goes into archives and the complexity that then leaves us with when we write history. So there is no such thing as the Middle Ages. I want to dive into this a little bit more. And now that I know the size of this screen, I promise I will make the words much bigger for the folks in the back next week. But it says, the first thing to say is medieval comes from the Latin phrase medium aevum, which means middle age. So I just want to name for you, that means this period is already a period defined by what it is not. It's between two things. What are the two things it's between? We mentioned one on this side, the Enlightenment. What's the earlier one? The Greeks and the Romans. Absolutely. And if we think about this, we're probably thinking it's the low point between the two heights of the Greco-Roman classical period, and then the Enlightenment. So a middle age, it's between two things. It's defined by what it's not. But periodization is always a construct. So no one is running around saying, oh, I'm born in the Middle Ages. It's lovely. I'm so glad we have these Carolingians running around leading us. No one would even call them Carolingians in that time period. All these titles are made retroactively. Has anyone read V.E. Schwab? She's a young adult author. Love her. Happy to recommend The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's a great book if you need some fun times. Anyway, she says in that book, history is a thing designed in retrospect, right? But the thing about that designing is that there are power dynamics involved in how the design is enacted, always, right? So periods are political, and I'm not just talking about menstruation, although that's also true. Periods are political because periods can divide time as well as space. The Venerable Bede in the 8th century was the first person to make time rotate around the birth of Christ. That's the first time we have Anno Domini. What changes about your sense of time if the central point is when Christ was born? And that's not a rhetorical question, genuinely.
Christianity becomes central to the.
Christianity becomes central. It is the lens through which you look at time, right? And there's nothing wrong or bad about this, but for the Islamic calendar, there's a completely different system for time measurement. And we'll talk about this next week when we talk about the Islamic Empire. AH is Anno Hejriai, when the year when Muhammad left Mecca for Medina, right? So the way we shape our time, literally our time, but specifically our naming of time periods, has something to do with power. And it has something to do with how that power is then disseminated when we tell the stories of this history. So the history of periodization has a lot to do with the story you want to tell, right? What's the word teleology mean? We're going to get some GRE words in today. It's going to be awesome. What's teleology? I'm looking at Rebecca. You can answer if you want, but you don't have to. Okay, teleology. What's telos in Greek? Yes. The end, the goal, right? So if you give a teleological definition of something, or a story, a teleological story about something, that shapes the way you frame all the things leading up to that goal, right? If we were going to tell the story of UGA winning the national championship, right? And we make that the culmination of the story, that means we're probably going to gloss over some of the crappy years, right? And we'll have this as the main point, and we'll eliminate some parts of the story that don't add to that particular telos. So when we label something, we're often implicitly suggesting what our telos is. So if we call something the Middle Ages, we know that the telos has zero to do with what's happening in that time period and is instead focused on these two other points. And that's problematic. You talk about the Dark Ages, right? Please, for me, your new medievalist friend, never use the phrase Dark Ages, because dark is so incredibly pejorative in the sense that it is in contrast to the Enlightenment, right? If it is dark, this is one of my favorite quotes from Linda Kuhn, if the medieval period is dark, it is the darkness of the womb.
Wow.
Yeah, chew on that one for a second, right? The idea that things are gestating and growing in really interesting ways. And so I want to sort of name that this conversation that I'm inviting you into has been a part of larger medieval scholars conversation for some time. And Carol Symes wrote on the American Historical Association blog in November of 2017, to take on the role of medievalist is consequently, and often all unwillingly, to become a minor colonial official whose job depends on maintaining the lesser status of the population under scrutiny. All the time expended on acquiring real knowledge of medieval lives and outlooks merely makes medieval peoples and medievalists complicit in their subordination to modernity. So we talk about the sort of perspective that gives us the Middle Ages, the low point between the Enlightenment and the Greco-Roman period. But all of that is implicitly below our sense of the advancements that we've made as contemporary peoples, right? There's this, we're going to go and historically analyze these lovely people. We're gonna be Star Trek, going where no one has gone before. We are going to uncover the Dark Ages, right? And that narrative, that story, suggests in many ways that we understand what's going on in the medieval period better than somebody who's living there, which is ironic.
Arrogant.
Arrogant is a better word for it, indeed. It is incredibly arrogant. And I think that we want to problematize in this first class a lot of the narratives that have been created and structured around this idea that, well, we've studied this, we figured it out. We haven't figured out anything about the medieval period. And part of that is because historians are political too. Hate to break it to you. History is not a secular art. It is not a dispassionate art. It is, we like to say that historians can take a step away from, we're not like the pastoral care people who are all like in their feelings and stuff. We look at things dispassionately, which is incredibly false on every level. The idea is that medievalists with particular views have shaped our understanding of history. For example, the concept of the Middle Ages, the idea of medieval Europe as a time period, became a part of the scholarly conversation in the 18th and 19th centuries when modern European imperialism colored everything that was being done academically. It's the same scholarly conversation that proved the necessity of slavery. It's the same historical, quote unquote, scientific discipline that use birth narratives, origin stories, like you talked about the first week, that they sort of borrowed from their buddies, the biologists, to create a metaphor for the telling of history, where the goal was to find the birth of their own nations. Talk about a teleological argument, right? Well, I'm French, I'm going to walk through this history finding the beginning of France. In the 7th and 8th century, there was absolutely no understanding of statehood or even a kingdom as such. And we'll talk about that next week as it develops. So the idea that we are going to, as 18th century, 19th century scholars, return to this history with the purpose of finding our own nation's origins really colors how it changes the way you see that particular period in history, right? And this conflation of cultural, historical, and political identity is the problem. This is where we get into the problem of ethnic nationalism, where I say, well, this nation descended from these people who looked and sounded exactly like me. And all the differences are collapsed in order to make that metaphor work. So when you think about the medievalists who created the notion of medieval history, which didn't exist as like a scholarly pursuit until the 18th and 19th century, the fact that these are the people who are justifying slavery and who in a second will talk about creating categories for race, it makes sense that their viewpoints are coded into the story they're telling about history, and that has a very particular perspective. So historians are political. Medievalists with particular views have shaped our understanding of history, and more importantly, medievalists have shaped the evidence and archive we have from history. It was raised a second ago. How do we decide what artifacts are preserved? Imagine, say, I don't know, 1,000 years from now, which is about our removed period from the medieval times, the only thing they had to know about Atlanta in the post-COVID era were 2 people's Twitter feeds. Depending on who those 2 people are, that story is going to take a very particular shape. It's the same sort of arbitrariness in many ways when we have archives where we have 2 letters from one person, and then we say, boy, we know how 20-something women lived in this particular monastery because we have this one lady's letter. Maybe she was having a bad day. right? And the fact that someone decided that these letters were worthy of preserving shapes the history we can tell. Does that make sense? And there's a lot of sort of social scientific work being done to fill out that narrative. So they'll do cryptozoology, which is a fun word, where they go and look at people's bones to sort of talk about biologically the kinds of things that were happening. So they can say peasants in the 11th century in Europe really had nasal cavity problems because of the fires that were inside their one-room homes. We can actually see that in their nasal cavities. It's very interesting, but that's the route we have to go to recover the average person, because who's writing letters? Absolutely. Who's preserving letters? The same. And monasteries and clerical institutions who have a very particular point of view and a particular story and things that they're interested in. One of the most amazing archives we have is the Cairo Geniza papyri collection. And it's literally a trash heap. The only reason we know about what people ordered from nearby lands is because we have shopping lists from this trash heap. The arbitrariness of the stories we tell is significant. And our inability to tell anything close to a universal narrative about this time period adds to people's tendency to flatten out the differences, right? If we don't have a ton of stuff with evidence here, well, then that eliminates the nuance, and I can say, well, this person is exactly like me, right? Look, we have this one letter. She's saying the exact same things I was. She was tired that day. Tired of, yeah, all of this stuff is tied up into the idea that contemporary and early modern people played a huge role in how sources were preserved and what sources were preserved. So historians are political. Hate to say that to you, but the nature of that means, and this is by an author named Cord Whitaker, whose book Black Metaphors, How Modern Racism Emerged from Medieval Race Thinking is one I will suggest to you at the end of class. I'll give you a list of things you might want to check out. He says the cultural fantasy or mirage of history is constructed through rhetoric. This historical story has its genesis in material reality, but quickly moves into the realms of imagination and interpretation. It is what he calls a shimmering metaphor that funnels reality through a series of conditions that produce illusions. So what does that mean?
Well, for one thing, it means how does the reader or the listener interpret it?
Absolutely. It means multiple readers or listeners could be looking at the exact same thing and then later on give you a completely different eyewitness report. We know this is a fact. Yes, John.
The other thing that may apply to this is when I think about people that are great storytellers.
Yes.
They will, exaggerate their stories. They will twist their stories.
Absolutely.
They'll adjust their stories to make a better story.
Absolutely, and adjust to the audience that they have.
And what's interesting is, I've gotten older, in some cases, I was there at the time of the story. I went, no, that's not how it happened.
Absolutely. I do this with my siblings all the
If you tell it the
time.
way, if you tell it totally factually, it's sort of boring.
Indeed. Yes.
From a statistician's point
Aha.
of view, you have an inadequate database.
Amen.
So it allows you to interpret any way you
The
want.
statistical sample is too small. We cannot generalize from it. Absolutely. Don't scare you down, Wade. Love it.
It seems to me that there's, in terms of looking at a situation, and if you don't have an input, if you write, you can't write history until it happens.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, and then once it happens, then it seems to be the whole process depends on interpretation.
Absolutely, 1000%.
There are people who write it, and then once it's written, there are people who look at it over a period of time and say, here's a little spot we should take, and here's a spot.
That's the
And
field
it's
of
all-
historiography.
You don't know what to believe sometimes.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're pointing at here. Cord Whitaker is saying there is a thing, a material reality out there. There's some data. We see some data. That's a fact. But our positionality towards that data changes how we see it. It becomes this shimmering metaphor that takes the facts, the reality, the story, and filters them through our context. And some of this is inevitable, right? We are situated human beings. We cannot not be ourselves. But when we're historians, that overview, that shimmering metaphor, that overlay of perspective, whether it's political or ideological or national, that changes the way you see and tell these stories. And that's a piece of what I think takes us to the difference between medieval history and medievalism. So medievalism is the deliberate adoption, reinvention, and implementation of tropes the creator images to be medieval. And I'd add another layer onto this, usually with the idea of aligning that creator with the medieval past for purposes of elevating the contemporary creator. And that's where the ethnic white nationalism, Christian nationalism comes in some really, really, really problematic ways. The study of medieval history is what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks to counter this idea of medievalism. We're going to look at people, places, and stories of the past in an attempt not to claim we understand it all, but to be aware of our own situatedness and be open to the possibilities of retelling some of these stories. So moving on from the happy overview to the nitty-gritty yucky stuff, we're going to move into our discussion of the why of this class, which is the use of the Middle Ages as a benign nostalgia, a collective social myth that intends to use the past to define the present. This is what we see folks running around with medieval shields in Charlottesville are doing. It's when we see Deus Vult, which is the God wills, a crusader tagline spray painted on abortion clinics. This narrative of a one-to-one between the contemporary present and the medieval past relies on a flattening of the nuance in both places. So if I'm going to say my whiteness is contingent on me having been descended from Anglo-Saxons, I'm going to have to completely eliminate any differences between myself and 11th century Anglo-Saxon England, and we'll find out there's nothing really Anglo or Saxon about it. We'll talk about that week 4, week 3. Very exciting. I mean, that is written really problematically into so much of our American political context, our indebtedness to medieval England, right? Thomas Jefferson wanted Hengst and Horsa, who are Saxon war chieftains, to be on the seal of the United States. Whoa. What? That doesn't make any sense, does it? I don't think it makes a ton of sense. And I think the idea here is that if culture is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, these flattened out narratives where we uplift contemporary populations who feel discriminated against now, in order to uplift them, we have to connect them to a high point, a perceived high point in a past that is uniquely theirs. It's a benign nostalgia where we hold a line from the past to the present to appeal to a particular group of people discontent with their present circumstances. This is something that requires a non-nuanced understanding of the past. And this can be done for positive and negative endings, but by virtue of this flattening, the social myth creates in us versus a them, right? The point of creating this narrative of I'm connected to this Anglo-Saxon past is to say you over there are not. This social myth that creates the us versus them certainly has racial components. It has religious components. And we're going to break down some of those pieces. And I think one of the first places where we start to see racial difference codified into the academic study of history and biology is Carl Linnaeus in 1795, who wrote a text called the Systema Naturae. And in this text, he was a biologist, he described various peoples based on their physical attributes and imagined social ancestry. So, for example, among the numerous attributes he recognized, Native Americans were considered to be reddish, stubborn, angered easily. Africans were black, crafty, relaxed, and negligent. Asians were sallow, avaricious, and easily distracted. And Europeans, of course, white, gentle, and inventive.
He at least contributed to the study of plants.
He did. There's other good things here. Sorry to apologize, Carl Linnaeus. Yes, absolutely. There was a lot of really great biology stuff in here, but this is where we start to see race codified in the academic study of biology as a biological genetic difference that then leads to cultural differences and down the line sort of equity differences. That's the reason it's okay to discriminate against these other people, because by their nature, they are these bad things. And we, by our biological genetic nature, white people, are somehow endowed with our inventiveness and gentleness to negotiate the difference between these races. We're in a church, so I'm not going to say what this is, but problematic. So, how have medievalists and the study of medievalisms tried to push back against this? Geraldine Hang, who is the founder of the Global Middle Ages, which is a wonderful website that talks about decentering Western European history as all there was in the Middle Ages, because surprise, surprise, stuff was happening other places. In her book, The Invention of Race in the European and Middle Ages, she defines race as follows. She says, race is a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human difference, rather than substantive content. It is attached to a repeating tendency to demarcate human beings through differences that are selectively essentialized as absolute in order to distribute power, so as to construct a hierarchy of peoples for differential treatment. So what Geraldine Hang is saying is that the idea of the biological differences in race is as much of a superimposed category as Middle Ages is. There is no substantive biological difference that makes one race of people superior to the other. It's a category. It's a category that gets reified over and over and over again as a way of distributing power. What do we think about this definition? Yeah.
I was, well, this is gonna be a bit of a long answer. I was at an exhibit in New Orleans several years ago that was about race. And the first thing they had you do on entering the exhibit was sit down at a computer module and they showed, and you were supposed to identify what race the person was that came, the photograph that came up on the picture. And it was very easy when they showed, someone from Norway and someone from Middle Africa and so forth. But then you get to the Middle East, you get to Eastern Europe, you get to, and it becomes very clear that it's, that we're all on a spectrum. That it probably has more to do with, with what our exposure to the sun has been, and what the necessary adaptations have been for that. And,
Absolutely.
And, you know, it was stunning.
Yep, it
I
is.
didn't get very far before I was confused.
Yes, absolutely, right? And that's really helpful because I think our multiculturalism, we think that the contemporary world is the only place where cultures engaged meaningfully and through marriage and through literary exchange and through, that's absolute crap. Sorry. There were exchanges between cultures for many centuries before ours. And the problem that Geraldine Hang is saying here is that arbitrary demarcator of peoples has been used as a foundation for power systems.
Yeah.
When that becomes the reasoning behind the hierarchy, then we have justification for saying these peoples are less than, these peoples deserve less because of this long history, because of this sense of hierarchy, right?
Is she saying in that definition, is she created that definition as that it was created back in the European Middle Ages? It's a definition for today as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. This is her global definition of race in general, that it's the system of difference, of codifying difference. Yeah, that then gets, oh, there's somebody in the back that has a question, sorry.
Who's that?
No.
Who's that right now?
I'll give you sound effects.
Thank you. This is just really enlightening and encouraging. And I like to say sort of relativizes maybe specific historical myths we've adopted for ourselves.
Yeah.
Just to highlight, there's, as you well know, but there's a lot of really good work being done specifically in the history of the Christian church right now for these very reasons.
Absolutely.
So you have Diana Butler Bass saying, Christianity for the rest of us and the people's history of Christianity, because it's impacted power structures in all these ways, and almost all the, if you want to say, the progressive iconoclastic writers right now have some version of a people's history.
Yeah.
And it comes up with scripture interpretation.
Oh, yes.
Manifold witnesses, where there is no one exact way to interpret. All we have is stories from every culture and post-colonial, theology and all these things. So thank you for this part, but just for everybody to know, this is going on all through
in
the
every
church.
field. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I love sort of blowing people's minds when they're like, I have the one interpretation of scripture that is correct. I'm like, which manuscript are you reading? Because translation is an act of interpretation too, right? Absolutely. All right, so I want to give some tools from folks that can perhaps articulate this in ways that are really spot on. So Toni Morrison, in her book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and Literary Imagination, says that race has become metaphorical. So we started out with the idea that it's a title, a system superimposed to reify difference, right? Well, race has now become metaphorical, a way of referring to and disguising forces, events, classes, and expressions of social decay and economic division far more threatening to the body politic than biological race ever was. So what she's suggesting is that our 18th, 19th century understanding of race as biological has been codified into so many systems of power that we've reached a place where race is didactic. It teaches you something about those systems and invites you to reify those systems within yourself, right? It's terrifying. It's terrifying, and it's absolutely everywhere. Cord Whitaker, again, Black Metaphors, sort of nails down a little bit more of this, saying race was already metaphorical well before biological race in the 19th century. Blackness and darkness were used to denote a spiritual state, a bad one, right? Contrasting the medieval European reader, taming chaos and creating boundaries. So we think about the way in which, and we'll see this in some of the literature we read, the idea that dark, black, demonic, bad, not light, right? These metaphors, these implicit metaphors in many ways, are written into the systems and hierarchies of power and into the way history is written. and therefore into the way history is read, right? And these narratives have actual consequences. And so Sierra Lamudo has an amazing blog post on this, and I just want to read it in its entirety because it says everything I want to say really, really well. We medievalists need to build our racial consciousness. We need to understand that race is not synonymous with ethnicity or culture, nor does it exclusively belong to a scientific discourse that postdates our pre-modern period of study. It does not begin and end with skin color or biological markers of difference. Race is a structural mode of codifying difference into an ideological system. When we refuse to see race in the Middle Ages, the stakes are much greater than etymology or linguistics. We are refusing to see how hierarchical structures of difference operate in all of their nuanced complexities, including within multicultural and transnational contexts. We are allowing the Middle Ages to be seen as a pre-racial space where whiteness can locate its ethnic heritage. So welcome to the club. You all are now medievalists. And it's your job now, been voluntold by me, to think critically about how these stories about the origins of Christian identity, of whiteness, of American identity are steeped in these stories that begin, in many cases, in the Middle Ages. And if you don't believe me, I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which we can visualize these shimmering metaphors overlaying things we think are factual. So for example, this is the Hereford Mappa Mundi in around 1300s. It's a map of the entire world. Pop quiz, what do you think is at the middle of this map?
Jerusalem.
Yes, I did not expect you to get that right up. It's Jerusalem. Well done, Alan gets a gold star. So the idea then is that the physical space, in much the same way as this time periodization, can be manipulated to center what we think is important, and I could go on and on about Mercator maps and all how that is all wrong. What does it mean when you put Jerusalem at the center of your world map? It's the most important. Why is it the most important?
Jesus Christ.
Jesus was there. Exactly, person online. Well done. You also get a gold star. Absolutely. Okay. So we've got cultural norms and perspectives written into the way this map is designed. On the left-hand side, we have this goofy-looking dude who's got his eyes in the middle of his chest, and I'm wondering who you think this might be, and or where on the map you think he might live.
Remember Chimamanda Adichie's?
Oh, you do? Yes. Excellent.
Repeat that, I'm sorry. Say that again.
Well, when she talked about how in Africa, the idea was that there were men with heads beneath their shoulders.
Yes,
That line?
that's correct. These are the Blemmies, a warlike race with no head, but with their facial features in their chest. And it is he's holding a spear, and he's located in Africa, and at the risk of offending the lawyers in the room, one medieval writer says they're like lawyers who speak through their bellies. So here's the scale of it, just so you can see it too. But these stories are manipulated in really problematic ways, right? So if we've got the Blemmies as one side of what Africans could look like, we also have Saint Maurice of the Theban Legion, who, by the way, is carrying the exact same shield that the Holy Roman Empire later uses. Bet the Nazis aren't happy about that. The original standard bearer is right there. And the way that in contemporary politics these stories have been mobilized matters to all of us. We think of President Bush in 2001 saying this crusade, this war on terror is going to take a while. When you call something a crusade, who is he implying the United States is? The Crusaders, the Christians fighting to defend Christian identity against Islam. Anders Breivik in the massacre in Norway in 2011 said, Pope Urban II and Pope Innocent granted indulgence to all future crusaders. The Knights Templar are destroyers of Marxism and defenders of Christendom. We are crusader martyrs of the church, selfless defenders of the weak and the blind. So he construed his mass murder of 70 plus people as a crusade. Mitt Romney in 2012 began an international trip to visit in London, and one of his campaign advisors was quoted as saying that he was part of an Anglo-Saxon heritage, adding that the White House, aka the Obama White House, didn't fully appreciate the shared history we have. So now you know Anglo-Saxon is dog whistle for white. Jeff Sessions said, since our founding, the independently elected sheriff has been the people's protector who keeps law enforcement close to and accountable to people through the elected process. The office of sheriff is a critical part of the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement. We must never erode this historic office. We see the English Defense League on the left there, defending our country, misspelled, from radical Islam. Underneath, under that shield, it says, in hoc signo vinces, which is what Constantine said, in this sign conquer. We see Trump against wearing a Templar shield against a Bavarian village that's on fire, and a Crusader shield on a switchblade knife with Trump 2020 as well. The massacre in New Zealand in 2018 said, ask yourself, what would Pope Urban do? AKA Pope Urban, who called the First Crusade, the man who murdered dozens in the mosques in New Zealand. We also see on the Unite the Right rally on the bottom left, we see on the top the incursion to the Capitol with a Deus Vult Crusader flag marching on the Capitol after Trump doesn't win re-election. And on the right, we see Deus Vult spray painted on an abortion clinic by a person who bombed that abortion clinic in 2019. All of this to me says that American whiteness is real and hard and institutionalized, but it's built on an imaginary genealogy. These are people tying their actions, uplifting their current actions as theologically correct, based on this imaginary genealogy that they say begins in the Christian European past. So what we're going to do is pull apart the threads of that genealogy. And we're going to raise the curtains on this past, this illusory and difficult to parse state of whiteness. And we're going to think a little bit about how these stories that we tell can be told in different ways. So thank you for a great first class.
Let us all go in peace.
The love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. Yay! Thank you all so much. I'll see you next week. Woo! Thank you, online friends.
Thank you, online friends.
Say